Today we're going to talk about that most exciting of topics, genealogies. Now, many a person has gotten bogged down when trying to read through the Bible when they got to First Chronicles, because all of a sudden, after pages and pages of history and interesting stories, they get to lists of names that go on for several chapters in a row. Genealogies aren't that exciting to many people, but for some people, they are kind of interesting. Modern people like to trace back their ancestry, and mostly just nowadays, just because they're interested in who they were related to, perhaps. But in ancient times, genealogies were something that were very interesting to many people, both their own personal genealogies and also genealogies of their people group. So Plato, for example, records a certain sophist named Hippias as saying that the Spartans listened with the greatest pleasure to the genealogies of their heroes and men, to the settlement of tribes, and how cities were founded of old, and, in a word, to everything of antiquarian knowledge. So the Spartans were apparently interested in who their ancestors were. Like I said, I think most modern people look at genealogies primarily out of curiosity, but there are other reasons that a genealogy might be important or interesting. Sometimes you need a legitimized claim of descent for inheritance rights or to make some other legal claim. Some people do it to prove their ethnicity or national heritage, although I will warn you that sometimes people think their ethnicity or heritage is one thing, and then they start to investigate their genealogy and find out that it's something different. So you never know. There are religious purposes for genealogies. Mormons, for example, have a rite that's called baptism for the dead, and they will go through elaborate genealogies. In fact, the Mormon Tabernacle in Salt Lake City houses millions of names, millions of genealogies of ancestors of people who are members of the Mormon Church. And sometimes people just like to look into genealogies to determine distant relationships. So, for example, did you know that Barack Obama is 8th cousin with Dick Cheney? And he's 10th cousin with Sarah Palin. So you never know who you might be related to. All right, there are two main types of genealogies. There are linear genealogies, which are also called vertical, right, up and down. And then there are segmented genealogies, which are horizontal. The difference is a linear or vertical genealogy just lists one name. Usually it involves men. So this person is the father of that person is the father of that one's the father of this one. So even if there are other brothers and sisters, a linear genealogy ignores them. It just follows the path of perhaps the firstborn, or maybe there's some other reason for choosing one offspring over another. But the linear genealogy just goes in a straight line. Whereas a horizontal genealogy has branches. And so you have an ancestor, then all the children, or perhaps all the sons, if it's a male genealogy or predominantly male genealogy. And then it'll trace those different children that those different sons had, and so forth. And so that is a segmented or horizontal genealogy. And of course, the two can be mixed. Sometimes when you're looking at ancient genealogies in particular, you have listed in the genealogies not only the names of people, but also clan and geographical names. These are called eponyms. An eponym would be a purported ancestor who very likely wasn't a real person, but it's the name of a group. So, for example, some of the genealogies in the Bible, Genesis 10, for example, include so-called people who are the eponymic ancestors of a people group. So Cush, for example, is listed as though he were a person, but he is the ancestor of the Cushites, that is, the people from Nubia, south of Egypt. Egypt is actually listed as though it were a personal name. Canaan is listed as a personal name, who's the ancestor of all the Canaanites. In addition to eponyms, which I've just given you examples of, there are also gentilic names. Gentilic names are the names of a people group. So this is a little bit different than an eponym. An eponym would be something like Egypt or Cush. Sounds like a name, but it's probably not. A gentilic name is actually the name of a group of people. So in Genesis 10, we also see names like Ludim and Kaphtorim. The I-M ending is just a plural. So the Ludim, the name Ludim means people of Lydia. And Kaphtorim means people of the island of Caphtor, which was probably the island of Crete. Ancient genealogies, in general, often trace ancestry back to legendary, divine, or magical beings. And so there are genealogies outside the Bible that go back to people like Heracles or Zeus, or in British mythology, Morgan Le Fay, who is one of King Arthur's purported ancestors. As I've already said, most ancient genealogies and many modern ones focus primarily or exclusively on men and male lineages, and that is certainly true in the Bible. Women, when they're mentioned, are very much the exception. Now, there is a link on the class website that gives a list of 6 different reasons for compiling a genealogy in general. I'm going to list them here. 1 is identification for legal purposes, such as inheritance. 2, establishment of rights to a social position, nobility, kinship, the priesthood, for example. 3 is proof of racial purity. 4, prideful demonstration of a relation to a famous person's. Have you ever heard of anybody who traced their lineage back to somebody famous? My uncle was into genealogies, and he traced our family ancestry back to, depending on which branch you followed, one of them was Charlemagne, the Emperor Charlemagne, and another one was Julius Caesar, and another one was Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland. Nobody ever traces their ancestry back to, Jack the Ripper or somebody like that, some terrible criminal, or Bluebeard, the pirate. It's usually famous people who are in good standing. It's funny how that works. A 5th reason for compiling a genealogy: strengthening of position or authority by tracing your origin back to important ancestral appointment to the post. The thing that this reminds me of the most is in The Lord of the Rings, the stewards of Gondor, if you know the story. They trace their role in society back hundreds of years to the original appointment of the first steward of Gondor, of the city of Gondor. And 6th, to establish relationships among people groups, nations, tribes, and clans. How are they related to one another? So extended personal genealogies, that is more than 3 or 4 generations, developed fairly late and were associated primarily with the priestly writers in the Bible. That is, the P writer in Genesis and the chronicler, the person responsible for the books of Chronicles. The insistence on racial purity in the post-exilic period among the Jews made pedigrees very important, especially for priests and Levites. And the thing that's important to recognize here is that genealogies actually tell a story. It may just be a list of names on the surface, but actually they tell a story. So let's look at a couple of these genealogies in a little bit of detail, not a whole lot. Genesis chapter 5 is a linear genealogy that starts with Adam, the first man, and goes all the way down to Noah. So I'll just read a little bit of this. This is the list. This is Genesis chapter 5. This is the list of the descendants of Adam. When God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them humankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his likeness according to his image, and he named him Seth. The days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years. He had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. Seth lived after the birth of Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters, and thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And it goes on from here. One thing you notice right away is that these people live an incredibly long time, and the purpose of having them live so long in this genealogy, one of the reasons is to indicate the great distance that exists between modern times, that is when this was written, and the ancient past, when people who had great power, if nothing else, just great powers of persistence, lived for 700, 800, 900 years. The longest lived person in this list was Methuselah. He lived 969 years, but that pales in comparison to the Sumerian king lists, which list the names of kings who founded different cities in the ancient Sumerian Empire and tells how long they reigned. The oldest one reigned 43,200 years. So take that, Methuselah. All right. So Genesis 5 is a linear genealogy. Genesis 10, on the other hand, is a segmented genealogy that traces the spread of Noah's descendants across the known world. And the known world to the biblical writers was the Mediterranean world. So it includes the eponymous ancestors of different groups, such as Javan. And Javan in Hebrew is equivalent to Ionian, which is just another name for the Greeks. So Javan is the ancestor of the Greeks. Cush is the ancestor of the Nubians. Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. He's the ancestor, not surprisingly, of the Egyptians. Put is the ancestor of the Libyans. Canaan, ancestor of the Canaanites, of course. And so you have all these different families, all these different groups from around the Mediterranean world, both in North Africa and in Southern Europe and in Western Asia and in Asia Minor as well, modern-day Turkey. And these people groups are grouped largely according to the languages that they spoke. So the Philistines, even though they were Greeks, they quickly adopted the Canaanite language, so they're grouped in with the descendants of Ham and Egypt, not with the the Western Europeans, such as Japheth or Javan, because of the language that they spoke. All right. Another couple of genealogies I'll mention. This is the book of Chronicles, First Chronicles. Chronicles is particularly interested in specific families. They're not interested, the authors of Chronicles are not interested in giving detailed genealogies of every single tribe. They give a little bit about every single tribe of Israel, but there's special emphasis paid to Levi, Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin, because these make up the bulk of the people, the Israelite people, who returned from Babylonian exile. And when Chronicles was written, the genealogies were written in large part to establish legitimate ancestry. If you wanted to claim to be an Israelite or a Jew, you needed to be able to trace your family lineage back. And so these genealogies, for example, identified people who were members of priestly families. If they were descendants of Aaron, they could trace their ancestry back to Aaron. Or if they could trace their ancestry back to another of the descendants of Levi, they could work in the temple. They were Levites. If they were descended from David, then they had perhaps the right to become king one of these days, although there were no kings at the time. What about people who were excluded? Well, the Samaritans were descendants of some of the people from the northern tribes, but they were explicitly excluded from the group. And the Jews, the story the Jews told, was that the Samaritans were mixed between the northern Israelites and other people that the Assyrians had brought in, and therefore their blood was, well, basically contaminated. It was mixed with non-Israelite blood, and therefore they could not participate in the assembly of the Jews. All right, so in First Chronicles, you see the lineage of David in First Chronicles chapter 2. First Chronicles 3 lists many of the sons of David, and then there's a linear genealogy from Solomon to Josiah, and then after that it's become segmented again in the Persian period, which is when Chronicles was written. One interesting little tidbit that pops out in 1 Chronicles 6 is that Samuel, the prophet, is put into the tribe of Levi because of his role as priest, whereas in the book of Samuel, where Samuel is introduced in 1 Samuel, it identifies him as being from the tribe of Ephraim. So apparently his adoption by Eli in the book of Samuel was sufficient for his inclusion in the genealogy among the Levites. I'll mention real quickly two genealogies in the New Testament. There's both genealogies are of Jesus, and we've talked about them briefly before. The genealogy in Matthew chapter 1 is a linear genealogy starting with Abraham and going all the way down to Jesus, organized into groups of 14 generations, more or less. You can count them if you want. And it's interesting. This is an interesting genealogy because it includes 4 women, 4 Gentile women, in fact. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, although Bathsheba's name is not mentioned. She's called the wife of Uriah the Hittite, plus Mary. And these 4 Gentile women and Mary all have dubious sexual histories in their past. I'll just leave it there, and you can, if you know who they are, you know what I'm talking about. If not, you can look them up. And perhaps they were included to indicate that Jesus came to redeem Gentiles as well as Jews, and or that Jesus came to redeem those who society might consider to be sinners. Now the genealogy in Luke chapter 3, verses 23 to 38 is an unusual genealogy in that it goes backwards. It's an ascending linear genealogy from Jesus to God, showing Jesus as the Savior of the world, not just the Savior of the Jews. All right, so these are some of the genealogies in the Bible and some of the stories that they tell. So please read the passages and be ready for discussion. All right, I will see you in class tomorrow.